Hello, everybody. My name is David Brysh. I'm the psychology teacher here, and we're going to talk a little bit today about the history of psychology, as you could probably guess. Our essential question for the week is, what is psychology, and how is it used in different areas of our society? I wanted to talk a bit today about the what is psychology part of this essential question, and then use the rest of the week to sort of fill in the how is it used in different areas of our society. We're going to touch on that a little bit today. But we're mostly concerned about what is psychology. So I thought we would begin with a little bit of history today. So if you didn't know already, there's the psychology that we think about today has ancient roots. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, they created an early description of the brain's physiology. You can see kind of the picture at the top of the screen there. They were interested in all sorts of human anatomy, and the brain was one organ that they were really interested in because of the mummification process. Their culture was sort of created around this idea of the death and the afterlife and that sort of thing. And so they were very interested in the human anatomy. So they were one of the first societies to create a written down description of the brain. You might have heard of Plato, Pythagoras, or Aristotle. They were all Greek philosophers, and they were interested in the philosophy of the mind. So those of you that are in philosophy club at APS Online, we talk about some of these concepts or the concepts from these gentlemen in philosophy club all the time. Lin Shi, he carried out the first psychological test as part of China's school examination system. Almost 4,000 years now ago. In China, in order to have certain posts in the government or in like local municipalities, you had to pass exams. And so in order to do that, the culture of China has created this elaborate exam system there that's existed for thousands of years. And one of the first questions that they were asking as part of that exam system was around the psychological fitness of the people who were taking the test. So it was pretty much the first psychological exam ever given. And then I wanted to talk also about the Middle East and that part of the world. There was a scholar by the name of Ahmed ibn Salabakti who said that if the nafs, that was his term for psyche, if the nafs gets sick, the psyche gets sick, the body may also find no joy in life and may also develop a physical illness. So think about depression, or think about psychosomatic illnesses that we'll talk about later on. There were people in the ancient world who were interested in the same types of things that we're going to be talking about now. This is the Edwin Smith Papyrus. I know it's kind of hard to read because it's a little blurry, but it's one of the first medical texts ever written. And people are kind of unsure as to the creation of it, but it could have been like a document for military surgeons to help people on the battlefield, that sort of thing. But it could also have been just something that embalmers were interested in. And so they wrote it down. But it's from about 1500 BCE, and it has the description of the brain I was talking about earlier from Egypt. And it also has information about fractures and dislocations, about how to amputate. It's got different kinds of sicknesses, all sorts of interesting information. And it's old, most importantly. So, the point here is that people even from ancient times were interested in a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about now. They didn't have some of the tools we have, so we're lucky in that we have a whole lot of technology that's allowed us to get a peek into all sorts of interesting things about the mind and the brain. Psychology after the ancient times, sort of in the more modern times, we're talking the 16, 17, and 1800s, began as a pseudoscience. Pseudo means fake or pretend. And so a good example of this would be Anton Mesmer, who believed that gravity and animal magnetism could be used to cure your body and cure your mind. So his disciples were called mesmerists. Um, he was actually discredited, but the sort of he pioneered the idea of hypnotism, which now is used to unlock sort of hidden parts of your mind and memory and that sort of thing. But he really believed that it was gravity and animal magnetism that was the cause of your mental imbalance. Then there's the idea of phrenology. I don't know if anybody out there has seen Django Unchained. That's kind of a relatively new movie that had a phrenologist in it. It was Leonardo DiCaprio, where he was feeling the bumps of the skull. Do you remember that? Phrenologists believe that the skull and the brain have different parts of the skull and the brain that affect different parts of the body. So that part of the science is true, or the pseudoscience is true, right? Different parts of your brain have to do with different parts of your body and your mind. But phrenologists believed that the size, so they would measure your skull, the shape of your skull, they would feel for ridges, and feel your head for ridges. And mine's a good head because I don't have any hair. You would feel my head for ridges and bumps and that sort of thing. They would measure your skull and feel around, and they believed that they could be able to tell all sorts of things about you from the size and shape of your skull. Because you can see in this diagram that each part of the brain, right, is responsible for a different part and function and feeling and all those sorts of things. So they would say that if this part of your brain or if this part of your skull had a certain shape, then you would have this particular belief, or you would have this particular ability. You'd be good at basketball because this particular part of your skull has a bump in it. You know what I mean? They would say stuff like that. Now, obviously, that is untrue. They believe that the skull can form to the brain, but they kind of grow together. What we know now. So, but the part of phrenology that was true, just like Mesmer's work, part of it is true, right? Part of phrenology that's true is that different parts of the brain do correspond to different physiological responses in us, physical responses in us, and different parts of the brain correspond to language, to sight, to taste, that sort of thing. So that part was actually true. Now, well, if we talk about before we get off on the pseudoscientists here, the pseudoscientists were really popular from about the late 1700s, like 1790s, through about 1860, 1870, something about that, right around that time. This was used, like in Django Unchained, for instance, phrenology was used to explain why black people were inferior to white people, right? So obviously, it's not scientific because black people are not inferior to white people. And so that was why psychology at this time had kind of a bad reputation, reputation as a science of charlatans and that sort of thing. So then when psychology starts going through a period of becoming a real science, it's really important because people go from being kind of made fun of like Mesmer was to being considered scientists today. Right? So as we kind of talked about before, psychology came from a number of different scientific disciplines. They were all sort of growing together at the same time in the through the 1800s. There was neuroscience, there's physiology, the study of anatomy and the physical part of the brain. There was sociology, which is the behavior of groups. Anthropology, which is the study of cultures. Philosophy, which is kind of discovering why people do the things they do. All these sciences kind of came together in psychology. And the thing that made psychology as a science different from the pseudosciences before, like phrenology and like mesmerism, is because scientists started applying scientific method to the study of the brain, of the mind, and of human behavior. And once that began, then psychology started to become a scientific discipline, just like biology or just like geology. And Wilhelm Wundt, good German name, established the first lab to study psychology in 1879. So he was credited as like the first psychological scientist. If we were to define psychology, which you should probably do at the beginning of a psychology class, we could look in the dictionary, the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, for instance. It says psychology is the study of mind and of behavior. So when you're taking notes now, you want to, you don't need to write down everything that is said, obviously, right? We've talked about this a little bit. What you want to write down are the important parts. This would be an important part. Psychology is the study of mind and behavior. And there are two kinds of psychology. There's experimental psychology, which is, think of a guy in a white lab coat. And then there's applied psychology. In this one, you can think of a woman sitting across from somebody else counseling them. So an experimental psychologist, he or she uses scientific method and experimental design. So what they do is they hypothesis test. So just like in biology or chemistry or whatever other scientific discipline you can think of, you would come up with a hypothesis, right? People behave this way because of this reason. And then you would go and try and figure out an experiment to prove that hypothesis true. And you would test the hypothesis. And really what experimental psychologists are doing are they're looking for the reasons behind human behaviors, and cognitions is a word that means the same thing as thinking or thoughts. Right? So cognitions means thoughts. So experimental psychology has a lot to do with experiments. Very easy to remember. Now applied psychology, that's where you take all of this experimental data and studies and theories and you put them to use. So you use your psychological theories and the concepts and all that sort of thing to help people, usually overcoming their problems. Think of it like as a school counselor. That's an applied psychologist, right? Or any sort of counselor is an applied psychologist. You can also think of a psychiatrist who meets with patients and discusses their lives and prescribes medication and that sort of thing. That's an applied psychologist as well. But some things you might not know is that there are sports psychologists. That's an applied psychology position, and what they do is they help athletes perform better, right, at the peak of their ability. And then, of course, there's marketing and advertising and that sort of thing, which uses a lot of psychology. That's also applied psychology. So you can use psychology in all throughout your life. So even if you don't plan on becoming an experimental psychologist or an applied psychologist right now, you're going to use this all the time because it'll help you understand why people do the things they do, why people say the things they do, why people feel the things they do. And that's helpful in any capacity, whatever job you have. We're going to talk about the major theories next week, but I wanted to give you kind of a little overview about where we're going to end up with the theories. So there are some major ones. There are the psychoanalysts and the psychodynamic group of theorists. They're called, in psychology circles, they're called the first wave of psychologists. The most famous of which is Freud. You probably have all heard of Sigmund Freud. But if you haven't, you're going to, because they call him the father of psychology. He created psychoanalysis. And then after the psychoanalysts and the psychodynamics, the second wave of psychology is called behaviorism. And that's obviously the study of behavior. And the behaviorists were only concerned with the scientific study of behavior. So a lot of the behaviorists were, at the very beginning, were the experimental psychologists. And then, we still use behaviorism now as teachers, as parents. People use behaviorism all the time. Because really all you do is correct behavior and give rewards and punishments. You give praise or you withhold praise. All those sorts of things are behaviorist kind of ideas. Then after the behaviorists came the humanists. That's called the third wave. They were person-centered. If you can believe, like the psychoanalysts they would meet with people once a week for an hour for the rest of their lives. And then the behaviorists came along and they were like, no, we're not going to talk about your mother, and you're not going to lay on a couch, and you're not going to do all those things that you might think of with psychologists. Remember we talked last week about what you think of when you think of psychologists. And the behaviorists were like, no, we're going to focus on behaviors. We're not going to focus on, whether or not you were cared for by your mom. That doesn't matter. What matters is your behavior. Then the humanists came along and were like, man, you behaviorists are just, you're too cold, and like, not everything is all about behavior, the person is a person, right? So there's three different kinds of humanists. There's person-centered, is kind of the first one. Then there's Gestalt. That's how you pronounce that. Gestalt. It's a French word. We'll talk about in a little bit, or a German word, sorry, that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. And then there's the existential philosophies, and they had a huge influence on the humanistic psychologists of the time, so they sort of created their own humanistic offshoot called existential psychology. And what these three have in common is that they're concerned about the person as a whole. Whereas psychoanalysis really cares about your past, behaviorism really cares about your behaviors, the humanists were interested in people as a whole unit. Then there's the pragmatic school, which came after the humanists. And the pragmatists are really similar to the behaviorists. Psychologists now who practice like cognitive therapy probably are cognitive behavioral therapists, most of them. So these two kind of match each other. And there's different kinds of theories in the pragmatic school. There's cognitive, there's choice therapy, there's rational emotive behavior therapies, or REBT for short, they're called REBT. All these have in common that they're focused on your cognitions, your thoughts. Pragmatic school is focused on your thoughts. Now, some people they're not just pure thought-driven psychologists, right? They're not pure like cognitive psychologists. They add things to it like cognitive behaviorism or emotions, right? Rational emotive behavior therapy is kind of a combination of all three. Right? Rational thoughts, emotive emotions, behavioral behavior. And then in the contemporary school, you have things like solution-focused therapy and narrative therapy and feminist therapy. All these are relatively new. These are in the last 30, 40 years. And what you'll notice is that psychoanalysis started in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, and in the space of a century, what you've seen is a number of different therapies sort of grow from the therapies that come before. So you couldn't have pragmatic therapy without having humanistic and behaviorist and psychoanalysis come before it, because it was a reaction to those. And what you'll find now with most psychologists, counselors, and therapists now is that they are a mix of all of these different types of theories. So one person might be a cognitive behavioral therapist, and another person, might borrow some ideas from Freud and psychoanalysts, some behaviorist ideas, and some solution-focused ideas. But if any of you have ever had the experience of therapy, one thing you could ask, any therapist that is, what's your theoretical orientation? If you say that to that person, then your therapist, your psychologist, your psychiatrist, your counselor is going to be able to describe what they are, what theories they subscribe to. Let's talk about some famous psychologists because your assignment that's going to be coming up this week is going to be all about researching a famous scientist. So, knowing a little bit about, I talked a little bit about each kind of therapy there, each kind of theory. Uh, Now you get a chance to do some research about a psychologist that might be interesting to you. So the earliest psychologists, these are the psychoanalysts, the psychodynamic, the behaviorists. They include Sigmund Freud, they include Carl Jung. Here's a picture of Freud actually right here. They were psychoanalysts. Freud was interested primarily in your, like if you were a patient of his, he would be interested in your past experiences in early childhood. And then Jung, who was sort of a contemporary of Freud, they studied together and that sort of thing. And Jung was interested in dreams. He was a pioneer in the field of dreams and dream interpretation. Adler is interested in, or was interested in, how humans behave around other humans. He was the first person to really look into the social aspects of human psychology. Then Erik Erikson, he was involved in sort of life stage development. So he had a number of stages that a person would go through throughout their entire life. So he was interested in birth order and a bunch of really interesting concepts like that. And then in the modern age, you have a number of people here like Rogers and the Pearls and Yalom and Frankel. These mostly, let's go back a slide. These mostly center in the humanistic kind of category. Some of the pragmatic there. So that's kind of where we move to now. He created the person-centered approach and basically created humanism. So that third wave, this humanistic, person-centered kind of psychology was created by Rogers. Fritz and Laura Pearls were a husband-wife team. You don't see very many in the scientific community, husband-wife team. They created Gestalt therapy. And Gestalt therapy is really interested in perception. So these two psychologists were really interested in Gestalt means like a whole, a unified whole. So they were interested in how the mind makes things into unified wholes. From all the different concepts that happen to us, from our breathing and perception of the world around us, to our thoughts in our mind, to our emotions. How does our mind make them into something that is coherent, that we can think about? Yalom is an American psychologist who worked at Stanford in the, I think it was like the 30s to the 50s. Kind of was when he first started making a name for himself, and he wrote a ton of books, and he is an existential psychologist. Then there's Viktor Frankl, who's got a really interesting personal story. He was in I think a couple of concentration camps in World War II. And so that came to color all of his psychological perspectives. He's another existentialist, though. Rollo May was a contemporary of Viktor Frankl there. They were both sort of instrumental together with Yalom here of introducing existentialist psychology to everybody in the world. Then there's B.F. Skinner. He was a behaviorist. So you might, you'll definitely recognize, he had some really interesting experiments called the Skinner box that we'll talk about when we get to the behaviorists, but very interesting. He experimented on his own kids, which is kind of cool too. Well, maybe not so much for his kids, but interesting nonetheless. He raised his kids in Skinner boxes. Then there's Arnold Lazarus. I think he's credited as the first person to take cognitive and behavioral psychological theories and sort of put them together. He came up with the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, which a lot of people still practice now. And then there's the current group of psychologists, many of whom are still alive. There's Albert Bandura, for instance, another Stanford professor. He's best known for his work with sort of social psychology. So he kind of tries to describe how sociology and psychology are merged together. It's really interesting how people act in front of others and in groups and sort of things. Pretty cool. Then there's Aaron Beck. That's his picture here. I love this one because he's got a bow tie. Sort of famous for his bow ties. He is considered sort of the pioneer of cognitive therapy. He did a lot of research with depression and how to counsel people and talk to them about depression using cognitive behavior therapy. Then there's William Glasser and Albert Ellis. William Glasser created choice therapy, and Albert Ellis is primarily involved with REBT. Do you remember REBT from back here? Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. And so all these famous psychologists, there's many more, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but all these psychologists are famous for the contributions they gave to psychology with their theories. Here are the references for a couple of the parts of the text that I chose to discuss. And hopefully that helped answer some, or a little bit about what psychology is, especially sort of some of the modern ideas of psychology. And up next, we're going to talk about how it's used in different areas of our society. We talked a little bit about that already, but that's going to be our goal for the rest of the week. All right, well, thanks for watching, and I will see you in class.